Claire had a habit of arriving early to things no one else wanted to attend. She had been early to her father's first cardiology appointment, early to the conversation where the word hospice was used for the first time, early to the small, poorly attended funeral where the pastor mispronounced Gerald's last name twice and no one corrected him. She arrived early to the reading of the will as well and sat in a chair nearest the window, her coat still on, her hands in her lap, because the room was cold and she had stopped expecting anyone to offer her anything. Dennis arrived 8 minutes late. He was the kind of man who moved through spaces as though they'd been prepared for him, adjusting his jacket, nodding at the attorney, settling into his chair with the ease of someone who already knew the ending of the film. He and Claire exchanged a look, not hostile, just the particular flatness of two people who had never managed to become real to each other. Their father had been sick for 3 years. Claire had reorganized her life around it with the quiet efficiency of someone who does not believe in making their sacrifice visible. Twice a month she flew in from Portland. She managed the medication schedule on a laminated chart she kept on Gerald's refrigerator. She learned the names of his nurses, remembered which ones he preferred, brought him the specific brand of ginger tea he decided was the only thing that settled his stomach. She sat with him through the long, television-lit afternoons when he had very little to say and she had learned not to push. There had been one afternoon in the second year, before the diagnosis had fully hardened into routine, when Gerald had asked her to sit rather than simply allowing her to. It was a small distinction, but she'd noticed it the way you notice a change in weather pressure before you can name it as rain. He was having what the nurse called a good day, alert, a little restless. The oxygen line looped over his ears like something he'd stopped resenting. He asked her to bring the box from the top of his closet, the metal one with the dented corner, and when she set it on the bed between them he went through it slowly, photographs mostly, some paperwork, a rosary that had belonged to his mother. He did not explain any of it. He simply narrated, "This was Michigan, this was your grandmother's, this was before your mother." Claire had sat very still, aware that this was as close as he had ever come to offering her something unprompted, and she had not wanted to disturb it by asking questions. Near the bottom of the box was a folded bank statement, and he looked at it for a moment longer than the rest, then set it aside without comment and closed the lid. She had assumed, if she thought of it at all, that it was something dull, insurance, a closed account, the kind of paper old men kept out of habit. He put the box back on the closet shelf himself, refusing her help, and didn't mention it again. She hadn't thought about that afternoon in months. It came back to her only later, in the attorney's office, with the particular clarity of a memory that had been waiting to become relevant. Dennis had visited twice, once at the beginning when the diagnosis was still abstract enough to discuss optimistically over dinner, once near the end for 4 days, during which he took several phone calls in the backyard and spent an afternoon going through the filing cabinet in Gerald's office. He told Claire he was getting ahead of things. She had nodded and gone to refill their father's water. Gerald was not a demonstrative man. He had never been cruel to Claire outright, just routinely, almost structurally, less interested in her than she had needed him to be. She understood this about him the way you understand a fact about geography. It was true. It did not change. She had stayed anyway, because she was built the way she was built, and because some part of her still believed that presence counted for something even when no one was keeping score. He died on a Tuesday in February. Quietly, the nurse said, which Claire appreciated even if she wasn't entirely sure it was true. When Dennis called to tell her about the will, he used the word straightforward 3 times in 4 sentences. The house, the old 2-story on Clement Street where Claire had grown up and Dennis had visited occasionally, would go to him. The brokerage accounts, the savings, the car, all to Dennis. Dad wanted things kept simple, Dennis said. Okay, Claire said. You understand? Yes, she said. She did not ask why. She had already understood on some cellular level that this was how it would resolve. Gerald had loved Dennis the way people love the things they don't have to work for, easily, reflexively, without examining it. He had valued Claire the way people value a reliable appliance, gratefully maybe, but without sentiment. She arrived at the attorney's office at 9:40 for a 10 o'clock appointment. Dennis arrived at 10:08. The attorney, a careful man named Hargrove, with reading glasses on a beaded chain, went through the documents in order. Claire listened. She felt very little, which she recognized as its own kind of feeling, the emotional equivalent of a room that has been emptied and not yet refurnished. Then Hargrove paused. It was a small pause, but she noticed it. He set down one document and picked up another, thinner one. He studied it for a moment with the mild, practiced expression of someone locating something unexpected in an otherwise orderly set of files. There is a secondary account, he said, a money market account open approximately 6 years ago. He looked at Claire over his glasses. It designates you as sole beneficiary, outside of the estate. The room did not change temperature. Nothing shifted dramatically. Dennis turned to look at her, and the pleasantness he had worn all morning, that settled anticipatory ease, rearranged itself into something less composed. Not anger yet, closer to recalibration. That account, Hargrove continued, was never amended. Claire asked the balance. Hargrove told her it was not a fortune. It was not nothing. Dennis said he must have forgotten about it. Possibly, Hargrove said, in the tone of a man who considered that question outside his jurisdiction. Claire did not look at Dennis. She looked at Hargrove and asked what she needed to sign, and he told her, and she signed it. Her handwriting was the same as it always was, small, unhurried, slightly left-leaning. Dennis was waiting for her in the parking lot. He had taken his sunglasses off, which she noted the way she noted most things about him now, as a kind of data point. He said he wanted to talk before she drove back. She could have kept walking. She didn't. I'm not going to pretend I'm not surprised, he said. Neither am I, she said, and meant it more than he probably understood. He asked if she'd known. She said no, and watched him decide whether to believe her. It occurred to her that this was the first real conversation they'd had in years that wasn't scaffolded by their father's illness or its aftermath, and that neither of them seemed to know how to have it without him as the subject. He said the house needed a new roof, that the property taxes had gone up twice since Dad refinanced, that straightforward hadn't meant what she probably thought it meant. She let him talk. She had spent 3 years listening to men explain what things meant, doctors mostly, and she recognized the rhythm of someone narrating his own reasonableness back to himself. You could have told me you were struggling with money, she said finally. I would have listened. I wasn't struggling, he said, too quickly, and then, more quietly, I don't know. Maybe. It's not the point. What is the point, she asked, and he didn't answer, which she took as its own kind of answer. Before she got in her car, he said, almost like an afterthought, you were better at this than me. The whole thing. I know that. She didn't ask him what he meant by this. She thought she knew, and she wasn't sure the knowing would help either of them. She said, I know you know, and got in the car, and he stood there a moment longer than he needed to before walking back toward the building. On the drive home, she passed the house on Clement Street without meaning to. It looked the same as it always had, a little overgrown near the front gate, the paint on the shutters going. She had spent a weekend once repainting those shutters. Gerald had not mentioned it afterward. She did not stop. What she felt sitting in traffic 3 blocks later was not triumph. It was something more muted and more complicated, the exhaustion of years that had been real, the flights, the medication charts, the ginger tea, the long televised afternoons, the box with the dented corner, distilled into a document Gerald had opened and apparently never thought about again. Whether he'd forgotten it or left it quietly in place, she would never know. The not knowing felt consistent with everything else about him. She merged onto the freeway. The sky was the flat gray of a day that couldn't decide what it wanted to do. She turned on the radio, something instrumental, low. She drove.
Like, subscribe. Thanks for watching.